good afternoon. So we are particularly happy today to start the new edition of the Angel Webinar Series. As you probably know, the Angel Webinar Series is a well-established series of appointment for discussing topics related to global education and learning among professional researchers, policy makers, etc. It is a place for having on a regular basis a good discussion and a deep confrontation for about the topic that we are all interested in. So at this time, this year, we start this new series with a particularly important appointment, because today we are happy to introduce a topic which is very important, a topic related to global education in Ireland, a newly released book last month, right? In October, has been released by Bloomsbury Academic. The book Global Education in Ireland, Critical History and Future Directions. This book, I will briefly introduce this book, but then I will leave Elish to go much more in detail about the book. But this book is particularly important because it provides a comprehensive and deep critical outline of the state of the art of global education research in Ireland, including policy, practice, and research. Ireland is becoming one of the leading European countries in the promotion and implementation of global education, both in formal and in non-formal. For many reasons, Ireland is playing this role, and I hope that during the discussion and the presentation we can deeply enter into this analysis. Okay, so this is a very general and initial outlook of the book. Therefore, I invite Elish to to enter more in detail into the book and into the topic by outlining the topic of global education in Ireland. Elish, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much, Massimiliano. It's lovely to be here. Thanks to you and the series editors for your support with the book, and also to Angel for inviting us to talk today. I'm going to just give a little outline on the book that I co-edited, as you said there, with Niamh Gaynor, Jared McCann, and Stephen McCluskey, who are all here. And it involved 21 chapter writers from, as you rightly pointed out, across academia, NGO sector, kind of formal education, non-formal education. And that's one of the things that really drove us in writing the book, was that we wanted it to be a multivocal perspective on global education in Ireland. So I'll just share my screen, if that's okay with you all. And I'll just quickly run through some of the kind of, I suppose, the structure of the book, and just give you an idea. And I see some people here who also contributed to case studies in the book. And it's lovely to be able to explore it with all of you and some of the themes that have emerged, and that's what I'll do. So there is the picture of the book, and as most people know or are aware, it's published by Bloomsbury just there last month, and available to download free of charge by open access as well. The book is structured in terms of thematic chapters and case studies, and we really wanted, I suppose, that it would be appropriate for those interested in global education in Ireland, but also very much internationally. Whether you're a practitioner and you want to learn from case studies of practice or examples, they're not set up as ideal type case studies, but just examples of what people have been working on. What are the challenges that they've faced? How have they overcome them? And I suppose lessons that they've learned in the process. So it is a mix of thematic chapters and case studies. And as I mentioned, very much a multivocal kind of approach. and about critically looking back and looking forward. One of the things that I suppose from within the within global education in Ireland, we're aware that a lot of things have worked well in promoting global education in Ireland over 50 plus years. But this book, we wanted to also take a kind of a critical history approach to apply critical reflexivity to our own work and to the sectors that we're involved in and the perspectives that we take, with the idea that I suppose taking a kind of a critical multi-history approach can help us to understand why things are the way they are, what works and doesn't, and I suppose really about shaping contemporary global education in Ireland and the future. So turning that critical gaze back on ourselves and our work and on the institutionalization of global education in Ireland, on policy, on approaches. I suppose with the sense that global education might need to be and probably does need to be more radical and relevant in the future. So the book is structured a little bit like that piece that I have there, that kind of model there. We're using global education in this book as an umbrella term, though the terms that are used in Ireland more often are development education, global citizenship education, and the other adjectival educations. But we wanted the book to be very inclusive, as the Irish Development Education Association is. Those of us who are involved in kind of critical approaches to global education. So we use that term as Jean does and as Angel does. Acknowledging, I suppose, the long history of global education in Ireland, questioning what differences has it made, what changes have occurred, and looking at kind of five areas, I suppose: the changing context and terms, where different terms have emerged out of, what the philosophical, pedagogical, and political influences have been. Then looking at global education in Ireland in an international context. And that's kind of this two-way relationship, how Ireland has related to policy and networks and work internationally at a European level and more globally. And vice versa, then how kind of global and European influences have affected global education in Ireland. And then looking at curriculum developments. And lastly, I suppose, the thing about what's needed for the future, so future directions. So the book isn't a history book per se, though it does look back to look at the present and to look forward, and then the case studies, as I mentioned. So I think one of the things we wanted to start off with, and I want to start off with again, is about questioning, even after 50 years, and identifying what has worked well. And I hope some of those points will come out, particularly from the other contributors to the webinar today, questioning how we measure or what constitutes success. And in the context, I suppose, of the growing and the hugely challenging context in which global education operates, that it responds to the highly globalized, immediate, unequal, interconnected, consumerist, fast, challenging world that we live in. To what extent can we say that the integration of more global education into mainstream education is a success? So maybe it's always just partial. The question about what else needs to happen and how can we frame and imagine a global education that helps us to deal with the complex and intractable problems and realities that we face, whether it's locally, homelessness and poverty, flooding around Europe at the moment, internationally, Sudan, racism, xenophobia, genocide. We're familiar with these challenges, and this is part of the global context within which we have to ask these questions, I guess, about to what extent what changes have happened over time in global education? Are they enough? What else needs to happen? And this is what we're trying to do, I guess, to keep those front and center, to keep that kind of critical reflexivity and questioning in the book. So it is very much about identifying strategies that work, but also trying to, I suppose, stretch us to not be complacent and to try and question to what extent are we prepared as educators to support learners to, for example, bring about a world of social and climate justice, peace, solidarity, equity, and equality, as outlined in the Dublin Declaration. So, with all of that in mind, I just want to introduce the 5 sections of the book very briefly. You can imagine, like, there's hundreds of pages in this, so these are just like this is just the tip of the iceberg, I guess. So, in terms of understandings of global education and the terms in the Irish context, back in 2002, a fairly famous in Ireland report was written by Michael Kenny and Siobhan O'Malley on development education in Ireland. And at the time, the point was made that there was a vibrant sector. So that's going back now 23 years or so, a vibrant kind of active sector of NGOs and educators and, people who were involved in curriculum development. People were keen, but there was a lack of clarity on what development education is. And there's been a lot of debate over how important terms are or how they frame the approaches that people apply. And we wanted to kind of reflect on some of that, while also so the first section does reflect on some of that debate, while also highlighting the move, if you like, from a largely development framing without a lot of people still see development education as being the kind of the radical edge of global education in Ireland, whereas others see it as kind of problematic in its neo-coloniality. So it's about how one applies that term. So trying to engage with some of those debates while also highlighting the move largely from a development framing towards the other, what we're all familiar with as adjectival educations. So there's a chapter there that looks at global citizenship education and activism and a shift within concern on that. There's a chapter there from Aoife Titley on intercultural education and how that and anti-racism has kind of become more part of the the language and the approaches of global education in Ireland, and a chapter from Elaine Neville on education for sustainable development and its relationship with development education, and then a chapter from Niamh Gaynor there on criticality and critiquing notions of citizenship and questioning our understanding of citizenship. So while there has been a huge move in terms of the breadth and the depth of policy and analysis, and an understanding that there's different discourses within global education in Ireland, it raises critical questions about how they're applied in practice and what they mean. So in the second section kind of builds on that, and it goes back to looking at the philosophical, pedagogical and political influences on global education in Ireland. And I suppose it highlights the role of non-governmental organizations and religious organizations at the start in kind of bringing a critical kind of development, social justice approach to global education in Ireland. There's a chapter there from Jared McCann on liberation theology and its influence on approaches to global development education, on critical pedagogy from and Freire from Bernie Grummel. Bernie will talk about that herself, and Rights, Peace and Social Justice from Ben Mallon. And in those chapters, it just shows, I suppose, the intersectionality of many of those concerns and the importance, I suppose, the emphasis on global social justice in early philosophical, pedagogical, and political influences. Of course, there are absences in all of that, but we can talk about those at a later stage if anyone is interested. And we start with case studies there on the work of AFRI, in peace and justice education and activism. Trócaire, some of Trócaire's work in schools, it's a big NGO engaged in development education, has played a very significant role in the development of development education in Ireland. And the Praxis project in University College Cork, I know Gertrude is here from that, and she can talk about that if anyone is interested, I'm sure. In section 3, then, it takes a look at Ireland in an international context, and that kind of, I suppose, relationship, a multi-way relationship, if you like, between Ireland and Europe. Northern Ireland, looking at that and the context there and how that's different to the Republic of Ireland, as you might want to call it, and basically Ireland North and South, and how it relates, the influence of the international context on policy, on the organisation and institutionalisation of global education in Ireland and vice versa. And so obviously, like lots of different networks that that I suppose were established over time, different articulations of global education and the influence of all of that on approaches in Ireland and vice versa. So Doug Byrne has a chapter there, and Liam Wedgemont, and Liam will talk about that later on. And Stephen McCluskey and Gerard McCann have a chapter on the Northern Ireland context. And I suppose the challenges there in terms of Brexit and conservative governments, and highlighting the important role of relationships between state and civil society, and not assuming, I guess, that once global education is on the agenda, that it stays on the agenda, that it always is something that has to be kind of worked towards. And there are case studies in section 3. There's a case study on the role of Irish aid in global education in Ireland, and there's a chapter there on the role of IDEA, the Irish Development Education Network, from Frank Geary, that many of you will be familiar with. And that really highlights, I suppose, the importance of working together and maintaining diversity within a context of kind of a shared approach to promoting and supporting global education in Ireland. And at the same time, there are questions there, I suppose, about kind of critical distance from state, holding governments to account. In section 4, then, the kind of, I suppose, curriculum is addressed as one of the kind of areas of major success, one could argue, in the Irish context. Lots of people, I suppose there's a lot of evidence of reference to global education, global citizenship, development education in the formal curriculum, and Mella will talk about that in a few minutes. Mella has a chapter there on that. And there's a chapter also, I suppose, on how global education has become part of global youth work, and that's from Valerie Duffy, who's involved in promoting global youth work in Ireland. And I suppose it highlights the importance of the support that the Irish government has given through funding and through the development of strategic partnerships to support the integration of global education across different curricula. And but also, I suppose, the need for a lot more work in the adult, further and community education sectors, and a lot of questions about the higher education sector. Niamh Gaynor and myself have a chapter there in looking at global education and higher education, and the kind of, I suppose, the challenges of neoliberalism and how to integrate global education across the higher education context. So a lot of really important work has been done, but also there are gaps. And then how does one maintain the kind of criticality and the radicalness of the approach within the context of instrumentalist education approaches? So there's a case studies there on the Ubuntu network of initial teacher education providers, and a chapter in that section as well on the integration of global education into initial teacher education. And that network, I suppose, networking and working together has been really significant. It helps people to get a sense of kind of community, but also really kind of pooling resources and supporting each other. There's also a case study on Troca's Human Rights Project with schools, and it's just one of their projects. And on the online resource development education.ie, really important for supporting educators in implementing curriculum change. And the last section then looks at the future directions and explores different approaches, pedagogies, kind of sensitivities, practices, philosophies that we might need to apply in looking to more relevant, more critical, more appropriate and transformative global education into the future in the light of the complexities of the challenges that face us. So there's a chapter there on relationality and on a critique of policy from myself, on decoloniality from four authors, David Nyaluki, Eben Joseph, Alice Feldman, and Barbara O'Toole, a chapter on solidarity and activism there from Caroline Murphy in Kolov. And there are case studies then from Kolov's deep global citizenship education work, drawing on a decolonial approach, and Poetry Ireland's kind of approach to creativity. And in that section as well, Audrey Bryan gives a kind of critique of the impact of neoliberalism on global education policy and kind of questioning the skillification, that kind of technical approach to global education, arguing for us to go back to, for global education to go back to its radical roots and needing to apply complex kind of critique and decolonial approaches to the difficult and unjust realities that we face. Each of the sections is introduced by one of the editors. So there's a kind of a summary chapter at the beginning of each of the sections, and then obviously an introduction and a conclusion. So I guess from my point of view, in conclusion, and I'm not in any way attempting to kind of to reduce the book or to even reduce the conclusion itself. We've lots of lessons that we have learned about global education in 50 plus years. But I guess one of the things that we really wanted to highlight is that the next 10, 15, 20 years are crucial. Some lessons can be learned from other contexts, but we don't present it in any kind of arrogant way, because it is presented and it is written very much in a spirit of learning, really. And but at the same time, with a sense that change is urgent without there being any easy solutions. So we don't present it, we hope anyway, as a linear history because it's, I guess, the work is more important than ever before. So thanks very much. I think that's, sorry, I'm just trying to, I think that's me. And just to remind you that it is available freely by open access. And we hope that people find it really useful, and obviously would be delighted with any feedback that you'd like to give us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Eilish. That was really impressive. The introduction of this book. Well, this book is actually is really a monumental work and a comprehensive analysis of the current state of the art in Ireland. And as I said, Ireland is uh, a kind of an emblematic case for reflecting for everyone. So it's not just for Irish people. This book is for everyone in Europe, at least, because what's happening in Ireland is something that should invite us to reflect upon the state of the art, the role of research, policy, and practice in promoting global education in our country and worldwide. So let's continue. Now is the moment of Bernie Grummel. She was one of the contributor in the second section, the one the theoretical framework. She's she's professor at Maynooth University in the Department of Adult and Community Education, and she contributed to the book in the chapter, I think the number 8, so the one on Freire influences on the evolution of global education in community development in higher education in Ireland. Uh, Bernie.
What the editors had asked me to do, and what I'll just talk a little bit today about, is the philosophical, political and pedagogical influences on global education. And really in that, I really just kind of wanted to maybe talk a little bit around kind of what I found interesting from writing this chapter and doing the research around this chapter, and to also welcome and ask you maybe to kind of comment on what you would see in terms of kind of your own sense of the sector and how it's evolved, and maybe whether some of what I say resonates with you or not. So I'd really kind of welcome any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have in terms of that. I mean, as I kind of opened the chapter with, I was really kind of beginning this from the perspective of what might be described as kind of a sister department or sister approach. My own background is in adult education and adult literacy education, but global education has always been a core part of that. And a huge amount of the work that we've done here in Maynooth in adult education has been strongly inspired by and guided by the work of Paulo Freire, and in particular the kind of pedagogical basis of what we do is very much embedded in a lot of the theories that he spoke about. And I think in particular kind of 3 elements that acted almost as a guide for me in writing this chapter, which first of all was the kind of learner-centeredness and experience base of Freire's work, and just exactly what he means by that as well, in terms of that kind of really deep engagement and beginning with the practices of and experiences, the life experiences of people, and using that then to kind of construct and frame pedagogy and action from that basis. The fact that that is always collective, it is always premised and based in communities, in groups, and acts in and of and through solidarity, as well as kind of the second element of it, and just the kind of importance of that pedagogy based in group work and in group processes and in and from and with communities. Is the second element, I think, of it that is very important and unique. And then maybe finally, the kind of idea of education as political, and the idea of kind of education in and through praxis with a focus on social justice and action. You know, for me, that is what global education has always been. And a lot of the work, what Eilish spoke about, I think, and the kind of influence of this book is not only in terms of kind of its contribution in Ireland and in Europe, but it is, and it traces and highlights the global reach, I think, and connections of education. And certainly in looking back and doing the research in this chapter, that's really, I think, what becomes apparent. What I looked at in this chapter is kind of seeing what happened in global education through 2 case studies, in terms of looking at what happened in the community development sector in Ireland, and also looking at what happened when, as global education developed in the higher education sector. And I think you see some commonalities happening in terms of kind of the pathways of both those sectors, but also key differences that I think are very interesting for the sector, and they certainly speak to the future. And I think what we need to kind of pay attention to in terms of the future. All of that very much, I think, is embedded in the current education context and the current kind of socioeconomic and political context. In particular, I think the impact of neoliberalism and how that's impacted differently in both of those 2 sectors of community development and higher education, and what the implications then for global education and for the type of work that certainly Freirean ethoses and values have tried to encourage within that. I mean, I think what it really highlights is the challenges then and the tensions that when very different philosophical bases and understandings of education and of community begin to hit up against each other. in terms of that, and then what happens in that mix. Certainly the case study of the community development sector through the work of Training for Transformation shows the real vitality, I think, of that sector and where it emerged from, and certainly the type of engagement that it did, and what they describe as they're kind of very much working locally within communities, and very much kind of community development approach that was based in the experiences of communities and responding directly to those. But then what happens when that sector increasingly becomes co-opted, becomes embedded into state processes, becomes embedded into performativity, into funding criteria, and the reduced spaces for groups to work within that, which they describe very clearly within that. And that kind of danger of when you're working within the system, whose values are you working to, and what are you holding within that? And I think the kind of conversations with partners really gave voice to those tensions and what they're grappling with at the moment, particularly when, as happened in Ireland and in other cases, community and community groups often become quite an easy target when there's tough economic cutbacks and decisions made. This is seen as something that is not an immediate priority. And certainly what we know from the financial austerity crisis in Ireland was that sector was decimated at that point, and a lot of the social funding that they had built up was lost at that point. You see then a very different history, I think, in terms of kind of what's happened within higher education, but again, something I think that's equally interesting. And very conscious kind of Eilish, obviously, from the Department of International Development. Maynooth is here, and others as part of this network. So again, in terms of kind of their work, again, in the conversations that we had around that, I think what comes very clear within that is, again, that history, that piece of where it came from, the really strong influence of the Freirean values within that, a very particular type of education, one that had more of an international focus in terms of the type of students that you worked with, and the engagement within that. But that kind of use of same values, same approaches of Freirean values, and using that in what one of the respondents described as the pilot light, using the Freirean ethos and values to hold the collective endeavour, and the focus on social justice within that. But then the challenges of what happens when that becomes and works within a very different system, and a system of higher education that becomes increasingly formal, what participants describe in terms of kind of the pedagogies of working in concrete and control. What happens when you move into big spaces, timetabled lecture hall structures, very formal structures of education, where you don't necessarily have the freedom and the responsiveness to work in the type of group-based, flexible and responsive approaches and times within that. So what happens when the pedagogy clashes and is quite different within that? I think what both case studies really do reveal, and certainly I think our own work in terms of adult and community education reveal as well, though, is the constant creativity within that. And again, that learner-centeredness of responding to what is happening in a particular context, that need to be kind of critically reflexive and seeing and responding to what is currently happening. And I think that's kind of encapsulated very much in maybe was the kind of final section of that piece of constantly using Freire's work and his values and ethoses as a pilot light, and using it as a way of ensuring that we're making hope possible, that we're using pedagogy, we're using education, we're using community development as a way to work politically, to build solidarity, to critically reflect about what we're doing, the type of society that we have, and the role of education within that. And just beginning to kind of look to the future in terms of kind of what are the possibilities for us as we move forward, particularly given the huge challenges facing humanity at the moment. So I might leave it at that if it's okay, and said kind of just keen to kind of hear from people as well in terms maybe of what some of these themes of this wonderful book and how they've echoed with you.
So thank you for that, and it's impressive the role and the impact of Freire philosophy and theory of education into the Irish theoretical discourse on underpinning global education in the country. So, and it is very, very impressive. And I hope that we have time later on for further developing these ideas. So let's go on with the third speaker, Mella Cusack. Next, we move to another part of the book, to the section. I think it's section 3 of the book, the curriculum, section 4, the curriculum development. Because Mella, she's an expert of curriculum development. She has been working on curriculum development for years. She has also served as a chair of IDEA, and she's currently part of the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment in Ireland. So she's in a perfect position for discussing the role of global education into the curriculum development in Ireland. Mella, please.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about my chapter in the book, which was on global education and curriculum developments. And I'm very aware of the audience that's here, and that there's a level of expertise really in terms of the education system and curriculum more generally. But I thought it might be useful just to begin with a very short interrogation of what we mean when we talk about the term curriculum, because depending on where you are relative to the education system, you can have different interpretations of curriculum. Probably one of the most common interpretations is this idea of curriculum as the official documents, the guidance that the state issues, and so the intended curriculum. But there's also a much broader interpretation of curriculum, which includes those official documents. So it includes the intended curriculum, but it's also about how the intended curriculum is interpreted and implemented by educators and teachers. So, how that curriculum is then enacted in practice. And very importantly, it's also about how learners take and make meaning, how they experience the curriculum across all of the kind of education contexts where the intended curriculum is enacted and then experienced. And so all of this to say, I suppose, that curriculum is very complex. It involves multiple levels, a multitude of actors, lots of different interpretations, and it's influenced by a huge variety of factors, both global and domestic, and not least amongst the domestic factors is the ethos of, or the culture of the education setting or school in which the curriculum is enacted and experienced. So, that kind of framing is really important when we look at some of the challenges and the opportunities that the global education sector and actors have faced in the last number of decades. And when I thought about some of the kind of wins where global education are concerned in the Irish context, and the two maybe most obvious wins are related to the courses for citizenship education in our second level context. So in lower secondary, we have a course called Civic, Social and Political Education. It was introduced in 1997, so it's been around for a while and gone through a number of editions in the period since 1997. But at the moment, schools are required to timetable civic, social and political education for 100 hours across the 3 years of junior cycles. And it's compulsory for all students. So all students, experience learning, teaching, learning and assessment in that 100 hours. And then more recently in 2016, we saw the introduction of an upper secondary citizenship education subject called Politics and Society. Now that's an optional subject. At the moment, about 4% of the students doing upper secondary are choosing to do politics and society for their final second level exams. It's a kind of a slow burn, that subject. It's growing year on year, but it's a slow burn, and COVID has obviously interrupted some of that growth in the last number of years. And those developments, those first two developments, I think that the investment that larger NGOs with a global education remit like Trócaire, the investment that they put in early on in those years, advocating for the introduction of discrete curricular spaces for citizenship education was hugely influential in terms of making that happen. But also, and Eilish has referred to this as well, I think when she was introducing the book, you had a whole range of NGOs, both large and small, that came together collectively to campaign for those really important curriculum spaces. And initially that campaigning and advocacy work was taking place in the context of the Citizenship Education Network, which no longer exists, but we have our own, we have our global education platform now in Ireland, which is IDEA, established in 2004, and that kind of took up the charge when it came to providing a space for GE actors to come together collectively to argue for this curriculum space and for these types of developments. Also, I think it's really important to acknowledge in terms of wins that lots of global education actors, both small and large, work directly with education settings and schools, either in individual schools and settings or as clusters. And they, over the years, have done some really high quality global education work with, in terms of teacher capacity building, in terms of inputs with students, producing supports and resources that are linked to different subjects, not just civic, social and political education and politics and societies, but right across the kind of spectrum of curriculum subjects, both at primary and at second level. And then the final win on the slide is the CAME standards. So this is, in the Irish context, the CAME standards are the kind of standards that are set for universities that deliver initial teacher education, and they have to be reached in order for those programs, those initial teacher education programs, to be certified, to be accredited. And a few years ago, the latest edition of the CAME standards were published, and there are 7 core components in those standards. And one of those core components is global citizenship education. And at least partially that came about because of campaigning and advocacy work on behalf of GE actors to make GE visible in those standards. So that means that, on paper at least, we now have a situation where initial teacher education programs are required to provide opportunities to all student teachers to encounter global citizenship education. So it's legitimizing a lot of the work that was happening already. It's giving it a frame in which it can kind of situate itself. Those wins, once they become a reality, they also act as enabling factors. They then support global education actors and the work and the priorities and the activities. But there are some other enabling factors that I think are important to consider. So I think a few of the speakers prior to me have referred to the influence of the international on the domestic, and that also applies here. So the likes of our international commitments around the Sustainable Development Goals, around children's rights, have helped to produce an environment that is amenable and open to certain types anyway of global education activities in the formal curriculum sense and beyond that. And related is some of the domestic policies that we have. So the two kind of most obvious current policies, the ones that sort of really have global education written all over them, are our Ministry of Foreign Affairs Global Citizenship Education Strategy, and also our second national strategy on education for sustainable development, which is called ESD to 2030. And very importantly, both of those policies have a funding stream to go alongside them. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs strategy has had a funding stream for a long time. The ESD strategy is a more recent development, but it does offer alternatives in terms of GE actors that are looking for funding to support their work. Now, whether it's enough is a whole other question, but they certainly are there, and that's important. It's an important precedence. And Eilish had also mentioned previously some of the strategic partnerships that are funded through those policies. So, for example, we have a strategic partnership funded by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs called Global Village situated in the primary sector, and we have Worldwide Global Schools at secondary level, at lower and upper secondary level, doing really important work and resourcing sustained work over a number of years, which is also really important that we have that kind of sustainability of support. So both of those strategies very explicitly recognize the importance of curriculum development when it comes to realizing the aims of the strategy and realizing the aims and approaches that are kind of implicit in global education. And then we had a gene review process in Ireland in 2017, and because of, I think, a lot of the collective organisation that happened on behalf of GE actors at the time, it was very clear feedback that came from the sector. We have the recommendation from Jean around interdepartmental or interministerial cooperation and increased policy coherence. And I think one of the kind of evidences of that is that our second national strategy on education for sustainable development is actually owned by 3 government departments, which of itself necessitates a level of dialogue that previously wasn't there. And the final bullet that I have on that slide is a very curriculum specific enabler. So particularly since 2015, when we saw the publication in Ireland of a curriculum framework for lower second level, we've seen a kind of an increasing move towards that kind of curriculum framework that acts as a foundation or almost like a parent of the curriculum documentation that emerges relative to specific subjects afterwards. So it kind of, as I say, it forms the basis or the foundation for the subject-specific curriculum documentation. Like them or not, they often include overarching competencies or skills. And I argued in the chapter that those overarching competencies and skills are actually really important to come to grips with. I think potentially because they are actually an attempt by the system to equip learners with the skills or the competencies to be able to meet the challenges that are there in our kind of rapidly changing world. They are a representation of that attempt. And I think that they're probably an area of curriculum development that the GE sector needs to pay more attention to, either to critique or to recognise as a support. And that is argued in the book. And then again, being aware of the audience, I didn't want to say this was a to-do list because I know that some of this is already happening, but maybe it's just that we need to meet more of a critical mass in terms of making, making some of these things happen into the future. Because I think that at the moment, there's a huge amount of curriculum change that's happening at primary level and upper secondary. And we have opportunities for increased engagement in curriculum development and really strategic engagement to effectively influence policy and then out of that influence practice as well. So I would be of the view that GE practitioners need to develop a better, deeper knowledge of the education system and the education landscape in which we would like to see the change happen. And it kind of is stating the obvious. But part of that is understanding the structure and the remit of the bodies that are important within the education system. So like the likes of the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, which is the statutory advisory body to the Minister for Education around all things to do with curriculum and assessment, but not just the National Council. There are other bodies, for example, state support services for teachers that focus on teacher capacity building, that kind of take up the mantle when the remit and the responsibility of the NCCA leaves off. So even knowing where the responsibility of one organisation or body lies and where the next one takes up is really, really important. I think that as a sector, and I include myself in the sector, we need to have a better familiarity with relevant education policies and curriculum documents, and that includes the curriculum frameworks with their skills and their competencies. Often, I think we fall into the trap in education or in development education circles of thinking that because we went through school, we know what happened in schools, but education changes, documents change, curriculum changes, and as I said, we're in a period of particularly intense curriculum reform at the moment. So it's important to keep up to date with all of that, and to also know how curriculum change actually happens. Where are the points at which that you can actually have your voice heard and enact influence, and that can be critiquing what is being suggested as the direction of change, or it can be reinforcing the direction of change and saying that this is right, this is the way that we should go, and both are equally important. Sometimes there's a sense that it's only if you want to object to something that you need to take part in a public consultation, but actually saying that you agree with something is just as important in terms of evidencing the system in order to go ahead and make that change. And a critique will only strengthen what the final output is anyway. So I think all of that is really important in terms of ensuring that global education is appropriately included in curriculum, and it's included in relevant curriculum. And then finally, it's a long-term game, isn't it? It's an investment over time. Like, this is not something that we're ever going to see the end of. We need to continuously give it time and effort and energy. But as I said at the outset, I think we also need to reach a critical mass in terms of having GE actors that are equipped and recognised almost as knowledge brokers that sit across that boundary between development and education. And I think if we can recognise and communicate that potential, then it'll be hugely beneficial also in terms of curriculum. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mella. And let's go to the closing presentation. But last but not least, Liam Wagemont. Liam is everybody knows is the executive director of GENE, the Global Education Network of Europe, the organization co-founder of the Angel Network. GENE, among many other things, recently co-led, especially Liam did, co-led the process toward the declaration on global education in Europe to 2050, usually known as the Dublin Declaration, Ireland. Once again, so and in this case, today Liam contributed to the book, especially to the section number 3, and he wrote a chapter on global education in Europe, policy trajectories. So please, Liam, could you please introduce and say something about the role of global education in Europe beyond beyond Ireland? Liam.
Thank you, Massimiliano. And first of all, I should begin by thanking Eilish and Stephen and the editors of this wonderful book for inviting me to contribute a small chapter. I'll say a little bit about that chapter, but I suppose what I'd like to start by saying is the importance of the book and the process. My favorite French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, says to give people back a history is to give people back a future. And sometimes as we grow old in global education, or as I do, I hear stories and tales of things as if they were new, and happen to know that perhaps these same conversations and discussions took place 10 or 15 or 20 or even 30 years ago. And so I think it's important, in order to not reinvent the wheel, that we have detailed, critical histories of global education. I'll come back to that for a moment at the end in terms of Jean's work. But I think this is a wonderful book, and I'm looking forward to reading other chapters that I haven't yet had a chance to. But I do want to say something about the chapter I wrote, which does focus on the trajectories of global education in Europe. I'll give that a skip because it's too late in the afternoon. But I would like to focus a little bit on how global education in Europe has been influenced by development education, human rights education in Ireland. And I suppose, so I'd just like to make 5 or 6 points on that, or maybe 7, if that's okay. The first thing is that, the idea that global education isn't just something for a small group of people, but is actually about trying to get to as many people as possible, if not all people in a country, is, I believe, an idea that was born in Ireland in the 90s and that influenced Irish policy and strategy since then, but that also grew to influence global education across Europe. What we call now a universalist, right-based approach. The notion that everyone in a country, citizen or not, has the right to quality global education as a right, and therefore that strategies at national and European level should not be scattergun or involve pet projects, but actually work towards including all people in the country. This notion, I think, was born in Ireland and has been translated in different ways into both European and national strategies since then. A second influence that I'd like to highlight is the influence of working with whole of sector approaches. And this is something that earlier speakers have mentioned, and you see in Mella's comments about the importance of larger global education actors working strategically. And I think that, we see this emerging in Ireland and influencing other countries. The notion that we don't just work with the Scouts or the Guides or the youth wings of political parties, but working with all youth organizations through an umbrella body like the National Youth Council. This perspective around whole of sector approaches is also, I think, something that it's accurate to say was born in Ireland and shared elsewhere, as I think is also evidenced in Doug Byrne's chapter in the book. Not unrelated to that is the question of funding, strategy, and structure. And here, just to say a little bit about this, that at a European level, there is a kind of an ideology around, particularly around CSO funding for global education, that suggests that the right of initiative, which is an important principle, should be more or less the only principle on which CSO funding for global education is developed. And this is a little bit strange because that CSO right of initiative notion comes from the idea that, that development education, global education, and development cooperation are a sort of a marketplace. So to look a little bit critically at that, but also from the history of global education and development education in Ireland, it was clear that the the Irish system of funding and structures of funding from the very start, they balanced the right of initiative of CSOs with the right of government and policymakers to engage in and support strategic intent. And of course, that's not an either or. That is an ongoing debate. But coupled with that, the fact that you can't have a decent strategy policy at national level without a clear funding mechanism that is attached to it. That might seem like a universal truth coming from Ireland, but actually it hasn't been. And in some countries in Europe, they had national strategies or policies or government commitment for some years before a national funding structure was developed. And so that marriage of policy and funding is something that I think in global education we can also recognize as having Irish roots. Moving swiftly along, conscious of the time, I'd like to just focus on two other areas that Irish engagement has influenced the European and also not just at a pan-European level, but with other countries in Europe. And one is a focus on evaluation. The idea that if you want to get to more and you're using public monies, that you also need to focus on better. So it's about more hand in hand with better. And that has led to the emergence of evaluation processes related to national strategy and funding. And I think in the Irish case, there has been a willingness not just to be, what's the word I'm looking for, hamstrung by models of evaluation that come from development cooperation and might not be appropriate for global education, but instead to look beyond that to models of evaluation that are more appropriate to global education. And finally, research. And we are at an Angel seminar, and I have to give a plug for the best academic research network in global education in the world. It may be the only academic network on global education research in the world, but it also acts as a bridge between policymakers and researchers. And this focus on policy related, on policy relevant research, but also on research informed policy is something that I think European ministries and agencies and others with responsibility for policy making have taken hints from Irish engagement, which, if you look back at the history of global education and development education in Ireland, back to the late 80s, early 90s, there was a focus on research as there was a focus on implementation. Finally, again, with thanks to the editors for their wonderful work, which has inspired our own work in Gene, as we do put our money where our mouth is in regard to the importance of histories. And so I just have a little call out here for a volume that we also produced this year, and that Eilish and Doug Byrne and others contributed to on national histories of global education in a variety of European countries. Thank you, Massimiliano, and again, thanks to colleagues who made this book happen.
Thank you, Liam. That was very, very interesting. So I invite all the people, all the audience, to look at the book. I remember that the book is in open access, so it's freely downloadable from the Bloomsbury website. Everyone, thank you very much for this excellent webinar, and thank you for this excellent book. I think is a very important contribution to the debate on global education research, policy, and practice. And emblematical example of Ireland, I think, is very, very, very valuable. Before to leave, let me just remind you that the second appointment of the Angel webinar series that is going to be next year on January 22nd at 4 p.m. The topic will be young people are research on a global issue, led by our Spanish colleague Adelina Calvo Salvador and other. Thanks very much for being here, and I hope to see you again next time at the next Angel webinar. Thank you.